in the movie was that Rasputin was an evil man and that he had plotted to kill the Romanov family, when in fact he wasn't. He was considered a holy man, and he was very close with the Romanov family, and that closeness earned a lot of hatred from the press at that time, who felt that he was getting too close to the Tsar, and that they were hoping that the Tsar would go in one direction, and they were afraid that Rasputin might be sending him in another politically. So they had a target on Rasputin's back, and it was socialist agents that finally did track down and kill Rasputin, using a friend of his to invite him to his house for wine, and they had it set up where they could try to murder him at that point. That story is a story in itself. It took quite a long time to actually kill Rasputin. He was not an easy man to die. He was a very tough guy. But finally he did succumb. They dumped him over a railroad trestle in the winter into a frozen river, and he was found there a couple of days later. He was killed in 1916. The St. Petersburg in the Disney show was called St. Petersburg. The actual name of that, and I know you know this from all your history, was Petrograd, which was later changed to Leningrad. And it wasn't until 1946, after World War II, that it was finally changed to St. Petersburg. So that was another place where Disney kind of changed the facts. She was not the heir to the throne, which the Disney movie kind of says that she is. Actually, she had 3 older sisters, and she had one younger brother named Alexei. And Alexei was the only boy in the family, and therefore he was, by Soviet monarchy rules, he was heir to the throne. He had, Alexei, as well as the others in the family, had hemophilia, which was proved later, and that was something that affected the entire family. And it was he was supposed to go in for an operation for hemophilia, and Rasputin, who had met the Tsar and his wife, suggested that they not operate on him, even though it was a life-threatening situation. And they took his advice. And Rasputin had said, if you do not operate, the boy will come out of this and he'll survive. And they trusted in his word, because at that time they were starting to gain some real trust in him. The surgeon said, no, we've got to operate to save his life. But they didn't, and the boy ended up recovering. So that's where the real trust in Rasputin came. Interesting side note on Rasputin, he had a daughter who survived and ended up coming to the U.S. In the 20s and 30s, worked for Barnum and Bailey. And she, I think, survived till around 1945, somewhere around there, if I'm right. I don't have that in my notes, but she did live quite a while after that. That in a real brief is the story of what happened to Anastasia. And that deserves a movie, if anyone ever did.
Yeah, definitely. And one follow-up question with that, John. So I've read about imposter Anastasias who would go around Europe and pretending to be her, that she had survived. She was the last Romanov. And all of these people were swindlers and would use their fake heir prestige to get money from people, to extort people, other things like that. Have you come across many cases like that of these fake Anastasias?
There were dozens of fake Anastasias. You're exactly right, and they all claimed to have to be her, but each one was taken on its own merit and demugged. The closest one that ever got to it was Anna Anderson, and she was debunked as well. So much later, when the bodies were discovered, they were able to run DNA tests, and although it was a tie, they couldn't differentiate between Anastasia and one of her sisters. They weren't sure, but both corpses were there. All the corpses of the sisters and little Alexei were there, as well as the doctor and the mother and the father and even the dog that they had killed. They had dumped them into an abandoned mine shaft, and it was years before they were found, but they finally were. And when DNA became available, that was the first thing they did. So that it was proved beyond a doubt that they just couldn't tell of the two corpses which one was actually hers, but everything else was pretty much put to rest.
That could be a good episode you do sometime on imposters.
Yeah, that would be an excellent episode. Imposters would be. That's a great idea. Thank you.
No problem.
The Great Imposters. I did one called The Great Imposters for one of my other shows that I have called 1001 Stories for the Road, and that was about Barry Bremer. Barry Bremer was a sports imposter back in the 70s. He was absolutely crazy. He showed up in left field one time for the Yankees. I mean, he would go to PGA events and pretend to be a pro golfer. I mean, he did football. He crashed a football game in uniform, was out there on the field. So he was a constant guest on Johnny Carson, just talking about his exploits. But the world got to know him. His family knew he was a little off, but they absolutely loved him. And be it good or bad, he created a legend for himself. So, what is yours?
Okay, so this is my third person, and I really have a thing for spies. I'm interested in spycraft, and I did a series on my podcast about spies in World War II. But for my third person, I wanted to go back earlier than that, and spies have been around forever. Spycraft is mentioned in Sun Tzu. We have a manual written in ancient Greek on military strategy, and there's a whole section on spycraft called, I think it's the Tacticon. But one person I want to mention is Francis Walsingham. Francis Walsingham was the spymaster for Queen Elizabeth in the 1500s, in the 16th century in England, when England is really emerging as a global power. And I'm interested in this time period because this is when you start to see the beginning of embassies being established in the European capitals. And what this means is that now you have a foreign government literally in your backyard, in your capital city. You have diplomats walking amongst each other. They have diplomatic pouches. They have confidential messages they're exchanging back to their home country. If a nation or an empire is planning an invasion of another person, you have this intelligence traveling and being transmitted between these people. And it creates this incredible opportunity for spycraft. And one of my friends from my PhD days wrote his dissertation on spycraft in the Mediterranean in the 1500s. And Francis Walsingham was right at the nerve center of all of this. So I'm intrigued when we think of James Bond and spycraft today. What did that look like back then? Did you have a Q, this gadget guy who made 15th century versions of high-tech gadgets for cryptography or infiltrating secure places in order to gather intelligence? What did that look like? So, and for Francis, he's crucial because England was outnumbered by its more powerful rivals on the European continent because it's a Protestant island in a sea of Catholicism. It never had great relations with its neighbors, with France, with the Netherlands, with Spain. It's invaded by Spain. Didn't have good relations with the papacy because it put a hit out on Elizabeth because of her so-called apostasy from Catholicism. So Elizabeth is in constant danger of assassination, and she was only really kept safe by her network of spies and her merciless spymaster, Francis Walsingham. And I think it shows how successful he was because she reigned for multiple decades, but wasn't assassinated. And Francis did this because he had to ferret out all these plots against the crown. And he did this by creating an intelligence network. He had contacts in Europe's trade communities, in the European courts abroad. So he was sort of like James Bond's M. He was the head of the equivalent back then of the MI5 or the MI6. So Walsingham, he took information wherever he could find it, whether it was from a sailor who heard from the latest gossip from a brothel in Marseille or a French politician with Protestant sympathies. He gained intelligence from ambassadors of Spain, and from this that he learned detailed information from the Spanish Armada's planned attack. So at one point, he said to have had 53 agents at foreign courts in his pay, along with 18 other even more obscure people. And they were in the courts of France, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and even the Ottoman Empire. There were some double agents that were under his employ, and we still don't know what their true intentions were to this day. So he was just good at recruiting people, good at outpaying them compared to their adversaries. So that's why he could get all this information. So Walsingham, he wasn't the inventor of foreign espionage, but this was just a staple of international diplomacy in the 16th century when the first embassies are established, beginning in the Italian city-states and then moving out from there. And spycraft became an arms race among European and Mediterranean nations, where large empires grow and rivalries form, and you have a greater need for specialized intelligence. And the way he had simple methods of espionage. The preferred method of spying was where crypto analysts, they would slice open wax seals of intercepted coded messages with hot knives before deciphering them. In his office in London, he had men trained in deciphering codes and ciphers and faking handwriting. He had a forgery expert in his employ and a cryptographer, another expert at breaking and fixing letter seals and reattaching them so no one could tell the difference. Walsingham also collected large files on public figures, and he knew detailed information on all important persons in England, down to county-level justices of the peace, so if he had to blackmail somebody, he could. He could also trace suspicious movements and determine the beginnings of a conspiracy. So if somebody was deemed a high-level threat, whether leaking intelligence or maybe becoming a double agent, he could extract information through blackmail. He also had torturers in his employ. So that was a more primitive way of getting information from people that he needed to. Probably he had some interesting people in his office. Being a spy, it wasn't glamorous like the MI5 or MI6 would make you, or the James Bond movies would make you think it was today. Spycraft was not a respectable profession at the time. Virtue and morality, they were still respected in a medieval sense, even though we're not in the Middle Ages any longer. You still respect the virtues of honesty and these knightly values. So political service to the Queen was considered, the respectable ways were in armed combat or doing it openly and not sneaking around like they did. So the world of spying at this time wasn't glamorous. In our imagination, we would think of a Tudor era agent that would seduce an upper-class socialite by buying her a tankard of beer in an ale house, but it wasn't like that. You would basically recruit these dropouts from Oxford or Cambridge who would know foreign languages, but they would just go to, they would get intelligence wherever they could, in taverns and brothels or wherever else. So Walsingham, probably the most famous thing he did was infiltrate the Babington plot. This was a plot to place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. And he did so by intercepting the letters of the Spanish ambassador in England. And he unraveled the plot through his network of spies that were embedded in various European embassies. So, now I'm sure if Hollywood got their hands on this, then they would have all these ridiculous contrivances. They would imagine the steampunk technology where there were these gas-powered repelling hooks and things like that spies would use to get around, like Assassin's Creed, those video games do today, where you're leaping around and all that. So that's probably it would be the poor man's Assassin's Creed if this were made into a movie. But anyway, I think that there's plenty there to work with. You have your 16th century James Bond. There you go. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Yeah, it's a great story. Walsingham, apparently quite a guy. I've got an unusual link to him that might interest you. In fact, it might spur you to more research, or you may already know some details. I was following up on America's greatest mystery, which in my opinion is the Lost Colony. What happened to those people? And that's from Walsingham's time. And I was doing an interview with Fred Willard, who is no longer with us, but he and his wife Catherine started the Lost Colony Center for Science and Research down in North Carolina, and he has devoted a couple of decades to finding out what actually did happen to those colonists who just pretty much vanished as far as all our records go, and they've been searching for them ever since. And it was Fred's belief, and I believe he was right, that Raleigh and Walsingham, but Raleigh being the man on the ground, basically in contact with those